The modern theory of evolution. We're going to look at some things that Darwin had trouble explaining that we are now able to explain better, and a note about complexity as well. So, first thing that Darwin was troubled by, among many things, was that the age of the Earth at his time was not known, or at least was not correct. So when Darwin was around, the idea was quite common to think that the Earth was 6,000 years old, or maybe somewhere coming close to 1 million years old, depending on who you asked and where they got their information from. Either way, that is not enough time to allow for the theory of evolution to explain the diversity that we see on Earth today, or even in Darwin's time. Why is this a problem? Because again, if the Earth is not old enough, not enough time has passed for the theory of evolution to work. So therefore, it would not be a good scientific theory, because it wouldn't actually be able to explain how we got this diversity if the Earth was only 1 million years old. So this was a big problem for Darwin. Evolution is extremely slow. It takes an extremely long period of time, many generations, for these small changes to accumulate. If the Earth was young, there wouldn't be enough time to explain the complexity that we see. So, we know now that the Earth is extremely old relative to biological age anyways. So the Earth is somewhere around, give or take a few 100 million years, somewhere around 4.5 billion years old. And again, having the precise age of the Earth isn't as important as having the approximate age of the Earth. So though we don't know it to great precision, we do know it's somewhere around 4.5 billion years old. Whether it's 4.4 or 4.6 doesn't really matter for the theory of evolution. What the point is that it has to be really old, billions of years old. We have since found out that that is true. Universe, about 13 billion years old. The evidence to support this comes from many different fields, so looking at geology and looking at physics and looking at astronomy. All of them go about gathering evidence about the age of the Earth, and all of them come to a consensus of somewhere around 4.5 billion years old. As a separate note, Darwin used fossils quite effectively to work as a strong evidence for evolution. For example, armadillos exist in certain areas of the world, and in those same areas of the world, you can find fossils of giant armadillos. So here's today's armadillo, and here's fossilized remains of an extinct armadillo species. So the fact that in the same area you find similar looking organisms, not the same, obviously there's some change between these giant armadillo type things and today's armadillos, but the fact that you'd find today's armadillos in the same areas where extinct giant armadillos lived supports the fact that maybe throughout time these giant armadillos have changed in their traits, and now we have a different type of animal that has descended from this previous type of animal. So lots of strong fossil evidence to support evolution, but one thing Darwin had trouble with was that there are certain fossils, so this particular freshwater crocodile, you can find fossils that's extinct in Africa of this crocodile. And across the Atlantic on the other side, you can also find in South America the same fossils. So if this is a freshwater crocodile, it cannot travel across the sea from one place to another. So how would you have the same fossils found in different areas of the Earth? It can't be explained, and was something Darwin could not explain at the time. However, in the 1960s, we figured out plate tectonics. And so we know that plates move around, because one thing they did see was, okay, well, if you look at the shape of South America and you look at the shape of Africa, they look like two puzzle pieces that could fit together. But that would only be possible if continents moved, and that seemed ridiculous at the time when Darwin was coming up with this theory of evolution. However, in the 1960s, looking at the geological evidence, we did find out that these continents do move, and the process is called plate tectonics. So this does explain how you can have animals in South America and animals in South Africa that look very similar, because at one point these regions were actually connected, and so you would have found similar distribution of animals in these similar areas. These areas now have separated and they're really, really far away now, but going back millions of years, these areas were the same area. So it would make sense that they'd have the same fossils. Another thing Darwin could not explain was he knew that what variation did and how it was the raw material that evolution would work on, but the source of the variation. Why is it that populations vary? That he didn't have a great explanation for, the source of variation. We now know of genetics, and Mendel was actually working on this at the same time. Unfortunately, Darwin did not read his work, and so he did not figure out that the variation is due to genetic processes. So we now know that genetic mutations are the source of variation, which natural selection can then work on. New traits can appear through genetic mutation. We get new alleles or new genes, new versions of these genes, new alleles, and this in turn would create a variable genetic pool. All the alleles of all the individuals in a particular species is known as a genetic pool, and if there are different versions of those genes, then you're going to have diversity among the genetic pool. Mutation in DNA is caused when base pairs or bases are switched, lost, inserted during DNA replication. So when a cell is dividing, it has to replicate its DNA, and occasionally it makes mistakes. This is where we get mutations from. Sometimes these mutations can lead to the duplication of a gene, and this is particularly important for evolution. Genes are really important to get right, but if you have an extra copy because the gene has been duplicated, you now have, it's kind of like a rough copy that you can work on, and you can mutate it, or it can be mutated with very little consequence because you have two copies of it. So if you have a gene in which you have a doubling of it, generally that doesn't have any harmful effects. If you have a whole chromosome duplicated, that can be bad, but generally just a doubling of a gene isn't particularly bad. And if that does happen, one of them can get mutated and you still have your backup copy. These mutations may help the individual, but because it's a backup copy, it's an extra copy, they definitely don't harm the individual. The mutation rates in the copying of DNA, it's actually quite good for DNA replication. It's about 1 mutation per million bases or so. So very good at getting things right. However, occasionally it gets things wrong as the DNA is being copied. So this adds up. We have about 1 billion bases, and so essentially each individual, as they go to copy their genes, they're going to be making occasional mistakes, and so we can look at, say, I don't know, 20 mutations per individual approximately or so. So within our population, just for a particular gene, you're going to have many mutations in the population itself. Most of them are going to be neutral, which means the base pair may change and it doesn't really help the individual or harm the individual. It just is a change to the individual. However, sometimes these mutations can be beneficial. A couple notes with definitions here. Homologous genes. So just like with anatomy, we know that species have homologous features. So if you look at your hand and you look at a dog's paw, there's a lot of homologous features between those two structures. You look at the numbers of bones and the placements of bones. They are similar because these are homologous structures. Genes have the same thing, and it makes sense because the bones come from the genes. So if the bones are homologous, then the genes that make them must also be homologous. So as genes mutate over a long period of time, we can see that these genes are mutating, the structures that are made from them are going to mutate, but we can not only look at the hands of humans and the paws of dogs, but we can look at their genes as well, and we can actually look at the genetic information of that. And if the genes, the homologous genes, are closer to each other, that means those two species are more closely related. So if you look at a wolf's paw and a coyote's paw, they're probably going to be pretty similar. The genes that make those paws are also going to be pretty similar. If you then look at the genes that make a cat's paws, they're going to have some similar characteristics. They will be homologous, but they won't be as close as the genes between wolves and coyotes. The cats will be more mutated, more different, because they are not as closely related. So essentially we can track relatedness genetically as well. Pseudogenes are interesting as well. We've got genes that have undergone mutation and no longer serve a purpose. So the word we use for this is vestigial. And we've talked about structures before being vestigial, things like your appendix perhaps, not really serving a great purpose, though that can be debatable. But essentially we still have them, though they tend not to have a real defined purpose. For example, mammals, they have about 1,000 genes for smell. So if you're a dog, you've got all sorts of genes that help develop the structures required for you to be able to smell properly. Dolphins have the same 1,000 genes. However, they're dolphins. They spend their lives underwater. They are not going to be smelling the air very much. So what we find is within those homologous genes, with dolphins, because they're not using them, fewer of them work. So of the 1,000 that are there, only maybe 200 work. And if you were a dog, that'd be disastrous. You wouldn't be able to smell properly. But because dolphins live in the water, they don't need that sense of smell like dogs do. And so their genes are free to mutate without consequence. And this results in pseudogenes. Mutations in these genes are neutral. They have no negative consequence. And therefore, they're going to be happening regularly. It's not that the dog's genes don't mutate, so the dogs are mutating at the same rate as the dolphins' smell genes. However, if a dog's smell genes get mutated and don't work, that dog is probably not going to survive. If it happens to a dolphin, it doesn't need to smell. It lives in the water, so it can survive. So therefore, these pseudogenes for organisms that aren't going to be using those traits are going to start to develop. So we need to know is mutations are the raw materials for evolution. We know that through copying errors, mutations are completely random. Genetic mutations due to DNA replication are going to be completely random. Environment can change that, otherwise though, completely random. Therefore, what some people get confused about is, okay, well, if mutations are what are the raw materials for evolution, and we know that mutations are random, does that mean evolution is random? Try to be clear on this. No. So, quick thing about complexity. Complexity is very unlikely to arise through random events. The example that's commonly used is a tornado traveling through a junkyard is unlikely to assemble a functional Boeing 747. It's not completely impossible, but it would never happen in the course of the entire existence of the universe. It's so unlikely. So complexity cannot randomly arise, and so it becomes a bit of an issue when we see all the complexity around us. How can you get such complex things from evolution if we know that mutations are random? And this is the part you need to understand, is that the mutations are random, but there's this process called natural selection. So let's see if we can do this. It works much better live, but let's try it as a thought experiment. Here's a house called Down House, and it's got a telephone in there. Can you guess the phone number for Down House? It's a 10-digit number, and so could you randomly guess what the phone number is for Down House? Being a 10-digit number, you have about a 1 in 10 billion chance of getting it right. So obviously very, very low. It's hard to come up with complexity from random chance. That wouldn't work. It's not going to happen. However, imagine this. You could pick one number, one digit, no problem. You can then build up to a 10-digit guess through a selection process. So I'm betting that you can't get this 10-digit number right. But if we do one digit at a time, if we slowly build up in complexity, we can get there as long as we have two factors. We need random chance, and then we need selection. So let's try it here. So you can choose a number between 0 and 9, or imagine a group of 30, a class of 30, picking a number between 0 and 9. If your digit is wrong, you sit down, you're out. You can think of this as being selected against. You're dead. However, if you select it correctly, you get to reproduce because you are awesome and you got that particular digit correct. And what we could do is we could demonstrate that by resurrecting 9 of your classmates. You can imagine that as a model for reproduction. This new generation gets a chance to guess the next digit, and they inherit the previously correct digit. So imagine this, 30 people in a room, you pick a number between 0 and 9. If you're right, you stay standing. If you're wrong, you're dead. If you're right, you stay standing. Not actually dead, just sit down. If you're right, you stay standing, and you get to get 9 people that will inherit your number, and they get to pick the next number. So in a class of 30, people picking between 0 and 9, you can imagine 3 of them would probably get the first digit correct. So the first digit is 0. So imagine 30 people guessing. 3 of them, on average, probably would guess 0. Everyone else sits down. Those 3 people then get to reproduce, and we get to make 9 of your classmates stand back up again. So that would essentially get everyone standing back up again. And everyone who is now standing has inherited their surviving trait of the correct number. So they get to pick again. And same chances. Probably 3 people would pick the next number correctly as well. Everyone else would sit down. They were selected against. The people who are correct would stay standing, they reproduce, and they would be able to select the ones that are alive at that time would select the next one. And we continue, and we'd continue, and we'd continue. So out of the group, each generation, most people would not make it. However, some would have the correct trait. They would survive. That trait would be passed down, very important, to the next generation, who would then get to select the next one. So completely randomly, what do we got? 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10. Completely randomly through guessing, which would be the random part, you can come up with the correct number, which is a seemingly impossible task to begin with. You can't do it with just random mutation, random guessing of the numbers. You have to have the selection process as well, and then the reproduction process passed on to the next generation. And then slowly we can build up in a very complex thing through that random picking, selection, and reproduction. Oh, there's the last number. So, random mutations always occur, beneficial ones survive and accumulate. The mutations are random. The selection of who's going to survive is not random, and therefore the complexity accumulates. This is how complexity develops, not all at once, but in a very, very slow process, one beneficial mutation at a time.